Hari Om. We find that our mind gets attracted towards worldly happenings, worldly objects, and hence our mind starts wandering. How can we keep our mind in the presence of Bhagavan all the time? By default, we are always in the presence of Bhagavan, the pure being, the I am. It is only that we let our mind wander away and hence we leave the presence of Bhagavan. So, what we need to do is, to the extent possible, as and when we get any free time, we should try to stay quiet, remain in silence as much as possible, so that we shall naturally remain in the presence of God. The moment our mind is quiet, in the very same moment we are in the presence of Bhagavan. We don't have to spend long time for this practice. In the middle of our normal worldly activities, even if we have few seconds of time here and there, we can just be conscious of being in that presence. We shall just be quiet, stay quiet. To be still is the way to remain in the presence of Bhagavan. So that way what happens is, to the extent possible, as and when we get any short interval of time, if we can remain in that presence, then naturally what will happen is, even during our worldly activities, that contact with that inner presence will always be there. So initially one may not experience that presence, but in due course of time, with consistent practice of being still, keeping quiet, staying quiet, not letting our mind wander on unwanted worldly activities or thoughts, but to keep our attention on the source of thoughts as and when any thoughts arise, so that the source of thought being the pure awareness, the sense of I am, the presence of Bhagavan. So the moment our attention is turned towards the pure I, then naturally the rising thought would subside back and go away. This is the way to deal with any rising of thoughts. We shall not try to fulfill those unwanted thoughts. Rather, the moment they arise, we don't pay attention to the actual contents of the thoughts, but just shift our attention towards the source of the thoughts. Since the source of the thoughts being the pure I, the presence of Bhagavan, the I am, then when our attention is shifted towards that pure I or I am, then naturally thoughts which had risen would subside and go away. Thoughts can sustain only with our attention. When our attention is turned towards the pure being, the presence of Bhagavan, then thoughts cannot continue and they would subside and go away. This is the secret. So, by this constant practice, we will just remain still. When the mind is still, what remains is the presence of Bhagavan, which is experienced as the consciousness of our fundamental existence, the I am. The existence consciousness, Satchit, the awareness of our own existence. The awareness of our own existence or Satchit is actually the presence of Bhagavan. See, what we call as we or me is just thoughts and vasanas. When we thus remove the thoughts and vasanas, what is there which we can call as our own? Nothing. So what actually remains then is indeed the presence of Bhagavan, the pure I, Aham, Atma, Nirguna Brahman. So with this constant, consistent practice, which can happen even during our worldly activities, one would gain the strength to remain in that presence of Bhagavan even while engaging in the worldly activities. We may falter here and there. We may let our mind wander every now and then, but still, each time we become aware and vigilant and be able to be watchful of that unwanted mental movement, then immediately we recover back by turning our attention towards the pure I, the presence of Bhagavan, so that thoughts would subside away and our mind will again merge back into the presence of Bhagavan. So, to the extent we keep our mind merged in the presence of Bhagavan, to that extent, naturally, mind will gain the ability and skill to stay in that presence of Bhagavan, and it will also enjoy being in that presence, because the presence of Bhagavan is the source of all auspiciousness, all the blessings. So, being in that presence means being in peace and happiness. And to the extent that our mind experiences such peace and happiness, to that extent our mind will relieve itself of the inclination to enjoy any kind of worldly pleasures, because the source of all the worldly pleasures itself is the presence of Bhagavan. This being the case, when one starts experiences the presence of Bhagavan within, start being in that presence of Bhagavan, the pure I, then that experience of peace and happiness would naturally make one understand the fact that the worldly, so-called worldly pleasures, they don't really have any value. So the mind will be more inclined to remain in that inner presence of Bhagavan all the time. So this is the kind of royal and direct way of the path of Mahayoga, by which one can engage in the activities of the world, one can live in the middle of the world, and yet can keep one's attention in the inner presence of Bhagavan all the time. What really happens is that when we keep our attention towards any worldly happenings or worldly objects, Vishayas, then actually what happens is that we, rather remaining as the pure I, we kind of dilute the pure I into the egoistic I thought, and then we let our mind wander towards the worldly objects, thoughts, feelings, emotions, etc. So in a way, the impersonal, the pure being I gets transformed into the personal, emotional, egoistic individual I, with its likes and dislikes, love and hatred, seeing things as right and wrong, feeling happier at times because something has happened the way we wanted, and feeling sad at other times because things have not happened the way we wanted. So all these things happen. So the way to go beyond all these opposites, good and bad, right and evil, right and wrong, likes and dislikes, attachments and aversions, so all these opposites, to go beyond them, the only way is to not to react to these worldly happenings and worldly events and worldly objects. So the moment we notice that our mind starts taking some interest in the any kind of worldly happenings, then we have to be extremely vigilant and watchful, so that we withdraw our mind. By our attention, we withdraw from these worldly objects and rather keep our attention in the pure eye on the presence of Bhagavan within. That way, what happens is we avoid reacting to these worldly happenings and objects, and instead we remain always in the presence of Bhagavan. So, while we are in the presence of Bhagavan within, in the pure eye, merged in the pure eye, then naturally it is not that we are engaging with any of the worldly objects now, but when we start reacting to these worldly objects, thoughts, happenings, etc., then we let our emotions, senses, feelings, etc. to engage in the worldly objects, and hence we get lost reacting to these worldly objects. So what is important is that even while engaging in the worldly activities, we should remain in a state of detached aloofness. It is a case of being passive and yet being the state of witness. So to the extent we remain in that state of passive aloofness, detached aloofness, what happens is that we don't react to any of the happenings or events or worldly objects. When we thus don't react to these worldly objects or happenings, then we stay neutral and we remain merged in the pure eye or the presence of Bhagavan. This is the secret of not losing oneself in the worldly happenings. Bahirmukham. So instead of externalizing our mind, Bahirmukham, we naturally internalize our mind, Antarmukham, Ahamukham, by keeping our attention on the source of our mind, which is the pure eye or the presence of Bhagavan. The more we remain in the presence of Bhagavan, the more we stay neutral and we remain untouched by the worldly happenings, even while actively engaging in the world. So this is the way, this is the way to go. This is the way by which we can be active in the world. We can engage our normal duties, day-to-day work, etc. But still, actually our presence or the attention will always be merged in the pure eye or the presence of Bhagavan. So to that extent we remain in that presence of Bhagavan. To that extent we will be unaffected by the happenings or events or the objects of the world. This is the truth. So let us take up the practice of Mahayoga with full earnestness. This is the highest thing, highest practice we can do, which can make us remain in the presence of Bhagavan always and here and now. It is immediate. This is the greatness of Bhagavan Sri Ramana Maharshi, that he has given us this ultimate, wonderful, but yet most simplest of the practices, so that by which we can remain in the presence of Bhagavan all the time, forever, eternally. Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala.